the only solution to any problem is military, then military obviously becomes sacred, and that everything that the military does becomes sacred. And that is something that our society, the value that our society gives to the military, no matter what it does, is extreme. The pictures here on the background are all from Tinder. And this is Israeli soldiers' profiles. Profile pictures from the last 2.5 years in Gaza, right? These are Israeli soldiers posting their own pictures from Gaza, from participating in a genocide to date. And it says a lot about where we are as a society in the sense of what do we value.
My name is Michael Spath, and I'm with the Indiana Center for Middle East Peace. We're a voice of conscience for peace, justice, human rights, and intercultural encounter. Sahar Vardi is an anti-militarist and anti-occupation activist from Jerusalem. She's a researcher and campaigner on issues of militarism in Israel and globally, including export of Israeli militarism worldwide. She's worked in Jerusalem. She's coming to us from Jerusalem, and she's worked there with the American Friends Service Committee, the Quakers. In recent years, she's campaigned and researched around the intersection of climate and militarism, as well as working on issues of activist safety and security. She was a conscientious objector from the Israeli military and served time in prison. And I'll just add a personal, I've known Sahar now for 15 years. And she has spoken to many of my groups over the years when we've been in Jerusalem. And she's just one of those people that when you get to know her, you just, first of all, just like her personally. But she's someone who I have just the deepest respect for. She walks the talk, as I keep saying to people. And she has put herself in harm's way, and she stood side by side with Palestinians who've been under siege. And she just really is one of these human beings who you just fall in love with and respect when you get to know her. So Sahar, it's wonderful to have you here.
These podiums are not made for my height. Yeah, people keep asking me when am I traveling back home, and I'm like, I hope that on Sunday. That very much depends on your president. The idea for me of the talk today, as Michael said, I research militarism, I look at militarism, I think that it is a very useful framework to understand a lot of the world around us. And I will be speaking a lot about Israeli militarism, but I hope that, and we will be making the connections to it here, but I hope it is clear that this is an example of militarism. I think that trying to understand Israeli society, Israel is one of the most militarized societies on a lot of different parameters. There's quite a few international institutions that do research into militarism, and Israel always ranks right up there. And I don't think that any of the things that we'll be talking about today in the Israeli context are special to the Israeli context. It's just very concentrated. So it's an opportunity to look at militarism in a way, and then understand also how does it translate into our own context. And maybe to start that, I'll try to explain why Israel is as militarized as it is. If we could have the first slide. I found these posters from early Zionist propaganda that, first of all, are nice because, you can't really read it, that it says American League for a Free Palestine. To clarify, this is Zionist propaganda. And so this is back when everybody understood that it is Palestine. That is the name of the land. And the liberation is obviously liberation from the British at the time. But what is interesting for me about this imagery is that it is very much the imagery that kind of shows how early Zionism saw itself. On the picture on the left, you can kind of see the person on the far right within it has a spade, as it has to do with working the land, right? A lot of the Zionist movement was about shifting Jewish existence into existence that had much more to do with working the land, connection to the land. A lot of that had to do with the fact that Jews were not allowed to own and work land in Europe. And so this was kind of building the mirror to that. And the person on the far left of that is holding a gun. It's cut a bit in this picture. And I think that that is in many ways a lot of the attempt of early Zionism to build a new Jew. It is a new Jew that is strong, works the land, as opposed to the diasporic one, is connected to the land, as opposed to the diasporic one, and is also armed, as opposed to the diasporic land one. And the picture on the right, I think, is even much more that. And again, we're talking about early 20th century. And what you see on the left is the diasporic Jew, right? The one that begs, that says, I want to live, and does that by begging. And in this case, collecting money for the Jewish agency. And then the picture on the right is the new one. The one that says, I want to live, and holds a rifle to do that. And I show these two because I think that a lot of what Zionism did to Jewish culture and to Jewish people is present a new image of Judaism that is based on holding a gun. If we kind of think about the rhetoric that we hear a lot about why does Israel exist, or why does Israel have the right to exist, I think a lot of the things that we will be hearing will have to do with persecution of Jews. There's a need for a nation state. There's a need for a homeland for Jews. And we often don't ask, what is the connection? What is the connecting line between persecution and a Jewish state? Why is a Jewish state helpful in preventing persecution? And that underlying thing that nobody says, but everybody knows, is the idea that there will be not just a Jewish state, but a Jewish military. And in many ways, the way Zionism presented itself is a militarized solution to anti-Semitism. And that's important for me to say because there were so many other forms in which Jewish culture and society dealt with anti-Semitism for thousands of years before that in the diaspora that were not militarized. Right? Some communities tried to keep away and were isolating themselves. Some communities tried to assimilate. Some communities migrated when needed. Some communities converted when needed. We can have a conversation about which of these solutions are better or not as good or all of these things, but there were a lot of different mechanisms to respond to anti-Semitism. And since this imagery began, for us as Israelis, but I think this is true for a lot of Jewish communities in the world, we have lost a lot of the other mechanisms and have become blinded by that one form of possible solution, which is militarism, which is a military solution. And for us as Israelis, that has become absolute. One of the examples that for me was really strong to understand how much of this is a choice to focus on one form of solution, was in the Pittsburgh shooting here in the States about a decade ago, when there was what they call domestic terror attack in a synagogue in Pittsburgh. And the first thing that the president of this country, this was a decade ago, but it was Trump in his first administration, the first thing he responded was a tweet, obviously, that said that there should have been security guards at the entrance to the synagogue, and that is the solution. So that is a militarized solution. And then the first thing that our Prime Minister Netanyahu said was that the only safe place for Jews is the state of Israel. They should be migrating there. And again, another militarized solution. That's where we can defend them. And then the Jewish community in Pittsburgh responded completely differently. Right? The Jewish community in Pittsburgh that is living here, wants to live among its community, was working to rebuild the synagogue with the local mosque, was framing the attack against them, the racist attack against them, not only in the context of anti-Semitism, which obviously was part of it, but also in the context of xenophobia, because the event that was attacked was an event about refugees, and kind of responded in building community around them. Not at all a militarized solution. And if you ask me, a far more effective and sustainable one. But that idea that that is also a solution to anti-Semitism, that is also a solution to brutal attacks, is one that we don't think about. Definitely as Israelis, but I would say that this is also very much true in a lot of things in this country, right? That we have been trained to think about solutions, especially to anything that feels like a security threat, only in terms of military solutions. And that narrows our minds significantly. If we could move to the next slide, I think for me, understanding where that evolves to today in Israeli society is a very scary thought. Because if the only solution to any problem is military, then military obviously becomes sacred, and that everything that the military does becomes sacred. And that is something that our society, the value that our society gives to the military, no matter what it does, is extreme. The pictures here on the background are all from Tinder. And this is Israeli soldiers' profiles. Profile pictures from the last 2.5 years in Gaza, right? These are Israeli soldiers posting their own pictures from Gaza, from participating in a genocide to date. And it says a lot about where we are as a society in the sense of what do we value, right? Because this works, right? Nobody would have posted this if this wasn't something that worked. And it, in a way, makes sense that Israeli society values soldiers and military as much as it does, because, again, in our narrative, they are the thing that protects us. They are the only thing that possibly could. And that narrative that says this is solution is automatic, right? When October 7th happened, and that is obviously a real attack that affected people's lives, the fear of people was real. I mean, I remember that feeling, but we didn't have a second to ask, what do we do with this? How do we respond to this? Because we had an answer. There is only one answer. It is a military solution. And before the dead were counted, Israel was already bombing Gaza. Before anyone understood what was even happening, our politicians were already saying that they will bring Gaza back to the Stone Age. And that automatic reaction is one that is very, it is terrifying. And it also just limits what is possible in the world. Beyond the question of social and political militarism, which is a bit of what I kind of started with, I think it is also important to look at the slightly more invisible aspects of militarism. Because soldiers on the street, genocide, ICE here on the streets, those are forms of militarism that we see, that are in front of us, and in many ways are slightly easier to resist. Because it's much easier to fight against something that you see than what you don't see. And on that, again, I'm taking Israel as an example, but this is very much true for this country as well. One of the powers that move states today very effectively and economies today is the military economy. And if we take an example from Israel, do the next slide. This picture was taken in a military expo that I went to last week in Tel Aviv. This was the biggest military expo since the genocide, so in the last 2.5 years. And this is Israeli companies selling the weapons, some of the weapons that were used in Gaza, some of the weapons that had their first operational debut in Gaza, and selling them to different companies around the world. And when I was standing in line to get in, I just started a random conversation with a woman next to me, who happens to be a US citizen who flew in for this. She is an accountant of different military industries here in this country, and so thought, I should learn about my clients and their world. And we were standing in line and chatting, and obviously I'm not telling her exactly what I'm doing there, so we're having a very nice conversation. And then at some point she turns to me and she says, "What's your favorite?" And I was like, "I'm sorry, what? What's your favorite weapon? What are you excited to come here and see?" And I honestly just did not know how you even respond to that question. But I think it's important that for so many people in the world, that's what it is, especially people who deal with it from the money side of it, right? It's a fun game that you can choose your favorites on. And there's no understanding, no perception of what happens on the other side of that weapon. How do you choose a favorite weapon? When we think about Israeli military industry, and again, just an example, but Israel is today the 8th biggest exporter of arms in the world in absolute numbers. Per capita or per GDP, that makes it the #1 exporter of arms in the world. And there's a need to ask, how is it that Israel, that is rather a small country, is as successful as it is in exporting arms? Just so I don't feel like I'm just speaking at you, but any theories as to why Israel is as successful as it is in arms export? Please.
Well, I know they brag about all their stuff's field tested in the West Bank and in Gaza, so that you can trust our stuff because there's proven that it works.
Yep.
I mean, there's a industry up in Traverse City, Michigan, 5 hours from here. We go for summer. I didn't realize that there's a company up there. Can't remember what I think they make vests and all that kind of stuff. So they appeal to the macho guys about get your stuff up here because it works.
That's one of the big reasons is that it is sold as battle proven, right? You wanted to.
Well, I was just going to say, because they sell a lot to the United States.
Right. So that too. And I think if we look at the different reasons, so there's definitely the aspect of the ability to test, develop, and more importantly, market weapons as battle proven. Not all countries in the world are involved in so much combat constantly that they're always able to show this is what it actually looks like. When you go to international arms exhibits, which I understand is only my hobby, and I hope most of the other people in this room don't tend to do that. But when you do go to those, you will see that most companies will have, a video or a simulation of what this drone does. The ability to show footage, actual footage of what this drone does, obviously looks very different to potential buyers. So that's one of the reasons. Another one of the reasons is definitely the US connection to the Israeli military industry. It is a complicated one because I don't know if you know this, but all US military aid anywhere in the world is not money going into foreign military industries. It has to be purchased in the US. Israel is the only country that has a bit of an exemption of that. 25% historically could have been used also overseas, but that has phased out already in the existing agreement between Israel and the US on military aid. And so this is a place where there's a lot of US money into a military industry. There's a very strong connection with Israel, both on sales and on buying. But today, the US is not Israel's largest customer of arms, and we will talk a bit about who is in a moment. And another thing that allows Israel to sell as much as it does is that it has very few restrictions on who it sells to. Not that this country is great at that, but there is a legal framework, the Lehi law, for those of you who know it, that does restrict the ability of the US to sell to specific regimes, even to specific units that are involved in gross human rights violations. Now, like any law, this is implemented very politically. And as we can see, Israel can do whatever it wants to, and that law does not get implemented. And this is true to a lot of different countries. It's much more of a question of political interest than anything else. But legal frameworks can be used for some things, and Israel doesn't have a legal framework that includes human rights at all when it comes to arms export. We also have very little transparency as to where Israel sells arms to. If we could have the next slide. This is one of the projects that I'm involved in. It's called DIMSE, the Database on Israeli Military and Security Export. A very original name, I know. But mainly what we do is that we try to map where Israeli arms go in the world because this information is not public. All the darker grays are the countries we've already mapped. The lighter grays doesn't mean Israeli weapons don't go there. It just means we haven't gotten to it. Israel sells arms to a little over 130 countries around the world out of 190 that exist. So the map should be a bit darker than what it is. But not having restrictions means that you have markets that are just not available for a lot of other countries. So Israel was the last country to continue to sell arms to apartheid South Africa. It sold arms to Rwanda 6 days into the genocide. It continued to sell arms to Myanmar after the arms embargo. And we can see a lot of examples of that in different places in the world. It was also used by quite a few US administrations to continue to sell arms to different Central American countries in the 80s, 70s, and 80s, when administrations here did not want to sell them because of the pressure that was happening here in the US. And so you could just sell it to Israel and have Israel sell it. So there's a lot of that kind of global aspect to this. You wanted to add?
From a historic standpoint, the 6-day war, Israel ended up with warehouses full of Soviet weapons from the Arab countries. And in Afghanistan, when they were fighting the Soviets in the 80s, Israel, via the CIA, supplied those weapons so that the US could have a hands-off appearance.
Yeah.
So it's...
And we were talking about this before with the gentleman over there, that how much of Israel's foreign policy has been also around being a proxy of the US. We know this very well. Even before 67 in the 56 war, quite a lot of Egyptian equipment ended up in Israeli arms, and that was sold already in the 50s to Nicaragua. So there's kind of a lot of examples of what that looked like. I think that one of the things that we should be noting today is that while I said that there are a lot of markets for Israeli arms, there are also a lot of markets that seem to be closing. And part of what has happened in the last 2.5 years of civil society around the world waking up and people going out to the streets and saying we do not want to be complicit in genocide is that both there have been quite a few countries who have stopped selling and shipping arms to Israel, including for about 5 seconds delays in shipment here during the Biden administration. Definitely not enough, but much more than we have seen before. and a lot of European countries that have taken that a few steps forward. I think that one of the sad things for me to say is that almost every country that has announced that it will not have any military relations with Israel, if you look hard enough, it still does. And part of it is because they're responding to public pressure. And if they can hide it from public pressure, they will likely continue to do it anyway. And so even Colombia, right, which is the country that not only has been leading a lot of the opposition to Israeli politics globally, it has led what is called the Hague Forum. So a forum of 22 countries that are calling for very severe sanctions against Israel, and yet is still using an Israeli spyware company against their own citizens. We have Spain, again, a country that has been very vocal around arms embargo on Israel and canceled a big purchase of Israeli missiles called Spike back in 2025. And then just a few months later, signed an agreement with a company called Eurospike out of Germany that is a cooperation of a German company with an Israeli company to manufacture the same missiles on German soil and therefore on European soil, and then Spain is buying it from them. And so I'm saying this not to discourage us. I think that there is a lot that civil society can do, and these past few years have proven it. These governments have felt like they need to take action. But to say we always need to ask, is this actually happening? How much is this actually happening? And dig a tiny bit deeper. And if we have the next slide, for me, this kind of connects us to looking at the larger picture. The graph here, left to right, is a graph of the stock of Elbit Systems. That is the largest publicly traded Israeli military industry. And it's July 23 to January 26. And I was trying to see where are increases? What happens in those moments that there are increases? And you would think that important dates or moments within the last 2.5 years of assault on Gaza would be places where those peaks happen. But then when you look at it, they are not. The peaks happen when Trump forced all NATO countries to increase their military spending to 5% of their GDP. That was an increase. It grew when Europe announced the Rearm Europe 2030 plan. It grew when the European Union announced that it will better the conditions for investments of defense contracts. That is when it grows. And today, 50% of military spending, of military export from Israel goes to Europe. And that is around what you were saying about the US. We are seeing most of it now transferring to Europe. And this obviously has to do with the war in Ukraine. But it's important for me to put that there because when we're thinking about combating militarism, and Israeli military industry and not selling arms to it and trying to in that way move that war machine, we cannot do it without looking at other places in the world. It just will not work. You cannot fight militarism in one country because that is still what the graph will look like. And Spain will still find a way to buy that missile, not because it cares about Israel or Palestine or any of it at all, but because it is part of that militarized system. And that is important for me because we'll fail if we don't understand these things. And I know that we'll move to the next slide. I wanted to give a bit of good things happening in the world. There are a lot of global campaigns talking about that, looking at global militarism and calling to cut that. There's the People Over Pentagon campaign from here in the US, and there's a few campaigns here in the US of coalitions of organization calling for a cut in Pentagon spending. Obviously, with this administration, that seems less likely, but there's definitely a question of what can be done and should be done to be shifting that. Stop Rearm Europe is a European coalition responding to the Rearm Europe project, and they're doing a huge amount of work also on local level, on regional level, and then a campaign that I've been part of in the last year and a half is kind of a new emerging global campaign calling for a 10% cut in military spending. And all of these, I know, sound a bit naive. Like we see the world that we live in, and it is a terrifying one, and it is one in which military priorities are the priority, and we see that in every field of life. For me, one of the things that was very strong to see with the beginning of the invasion, the Russian invasion to Ukraine, was what it did to all the efforts around the climate crisis around that time and since then. Because while there was a moment in which a lot of the world was focused on the climate crisis and on talking about things like net zero in 2050 and how do we shift into these places. And even if this country was never at the forefront of that conversation, a lot of other places in the world, that was very much a discourse from an understanding that this is a security crisis. This is the biggest security crisis of this generation, easily, if not of ever. And yet the moment Ukraine happened, the moment there was that old-fashioned form of how we see security, everything else collapsed. It stopped being a priority completely. And that's obviously not something that we can afford in the context of the climate crisis as a human race. But that is what militarized priorities mean and will always mean until we manage to break that down. And again, I know it sounds naive to say that we can break that down. How? What? Like this, we're so used to thinking in these terms, and I don't think I have answers. But I also think that it is naive to think that we can solve anything without solving that. And so that I think in some ways is for me kind of an opening up a conversation of where I think we should be talking, but I do want to challenge us to be a bit more optimistic, and just give a few examples of places where I think that we are stuck with thought of what is and is not possible. And often we're wrong. One of my favorite examples is a group of prisoners of war in a small island outside of Italy in the Second World War, while they were in the camps, were having conversations among themselves and wrote a manifesto about a union of different countries in Europe that would allow for people to move freely between it and allow trade freely between it and have structures in which European countries will make decisions together, which was crazy to be writing that down in a camp as prisoners of war in the middle of the Second World War. And yet that's a reality, isn't it? And it's not a reality directly because of them. Let's not have that illusion. But it became possible, what it was completely impossible. Another example that I like specifically on military spending is that in 1976, so in the very middle of the Cold War, there was a resolution in the Security Council that suggested a 10% cut in military spending to allow countries to move that money into their own internal priorities, especially feeding the poor. Anyone want to hazard a guess who submitted that proposal?
Donald Trump? No.
Not Donald Trump at the time, no. Any other thoughts?
Sorry.
So the U.S., I mean, Jimmy Carter, you're saying as in the U.S., it was the USSR.
Oh.
And in our minds, the idea that the USSR, in the middle of the Cold War, would be proposing, let's all cut military spending a bit, feels impossible. There's no way that happened. But not only did it happen, it was actually a result of almost 15 years of negotiation between the US and USSR officials to try to push for that almost happened. And I know we live in a timeline in which it didn't. But there was a timeline in which it could have. And it wasn't at all far-fetched. It was serious conversations that were happening between two superpowers at war in the height of militarism that were talking seriously about that as a possibility. And who knows what our world would look like if that would have happened and would have worked. Who knows where the arms race would have gone to if that directionality would have switched. And I'm just saying those things to kind of allow us to believe that things that feel impossible can be possible. It's not naive. It's naive to think that the way that we currently solve problems as a society can work. That is ridiculously naive. If we move to the next slide, I think I did want to bring that down a bit to our realities. I think that, correct me if I'm wrong, I'm not from here, and I understand that my understanding of US politics is very limited, and a lot about the reels that come into my Instagram feed, which is a very specific feed. But speaking to activists who are active here, 6 months ago, with this administration, with ICE moving into more and more communities, with all of the protests around Palestine meaning absolutely nothing to this government, with generally an administration that feels like it doesn't care about any of the mechanisms that we have set up as movements for change. Right? Protests do not matter. You can have all your No King protests and he will not care. Speaking to your congressman, it just felt like nothing is moving. All the tools that you are used to having for social change in this country, if you would have thought about it 6 months ago, did not feel like any of that matters. And there is a person who can make decisions, do whatever he feels like he wants to do, and they will happen. And then Minneapolis said, nope. And a decision that is still has that same power from the same administrative position was just met on the streets by enough resistance that it could not pass. Not to say that deportations don't still happen, they do. We all know this. This is not a solution. This is not perfect. But the truth is that Minneapolis managed to stop Trump's policies. Not completely, but in that moment. And I think that kind of seeing that moment is something that you couldn't have predicted 6 months ago. It was impossible 6 months ago. It was impossible that a governor will send the National Guard to stand in front of ICE agents. That's crazy. And yet people did that. Communities did that. And I think it is important for us to be thinking about the ways in which militarism is being resisted and where people do manage to make that change. And I know it feels very small relatively to the big picture things that we're talking about, but nothing changes without those moments. If we move one more slide, for me thinking about I mean, I gave these talks the title of hope in dark times, and I think the dark times are much easier to speak about than the hope. And I am trying to grapple with that. Think about what does hope look like in the reality that we're talking about, especially when you like sit and research militarism all day long. It's not, it doesn't look great. And for me, one of the things is also switching up a bit how we think about change, how we think about hope. And being grounded in Palestinian resistance has been very helpful for me with that. Because I think that there's something that is almost natural to Palestinian resistance, which is looking at a far longer timeline than what we are used to. There is a very important concept in Palestinian culture called sumud. It is often translated in English into resilience, but it is more than that. It is hanging on to land in many ways. And it is something that feels, if you look at change in 5, 10, 20, 50 years increments, it doesn't, it's hard to understand this concept. Because resilience doesn't seem enough. Just being, existing doesn't seem like enough. But in a film that some of you might have seen, No Other Land, that a few friends of mine made, and I think it probably did the rounds here as well. There's a scene in which, after a large demolition in one of the villages in Masafariyata in the South Hebron Hills in the West Bank, this is Ilan, the guy that's responsible for demolitions in the area, and then Basel, the guy who's holding the camera in this scene, says, "We've lived here for ages. You're wasting time. Leave." And so while houses are being demolished, he said, "I can resist. I can't stop a house demolition. None of us can. I can't stop that military power. But if Basel will not leave, all of that system fails." And that is understanding change and hope in a very different way. I have a friend who is a Palestinian citizen of Israel, so of the Palestinians who managed to stay during the Nakba, that was his family, and he was asked exactly about this, about hope, and about how do you have hope for Palestinian people during genocide, why you see annihilation, why there are voices talking about erasing Palestinian existence from the river to the sea. And he said, "We've been through this before. The Nakba happened. 700,000 Palestinians, the vast majority of Palestinians, were displaced. And then a few managed to stay. And today, there are more Palestinians within 48, within Israel of today, than there were before 48. And that's also change. And that's not, it's not a nice pink hope, but it's a realistic one. And it's one that requires us to not just look for immediate success, to not just look at how our actions today bring this and then they bring that, and then that's what change looks like. But to believe that our actions today somehow, in a way that we cannot predict or see, accumulate to change. And I was talking to a friend here just a couple days ago who was talking about Minnesota and was saying, well, one of the things that we have to really remember about what's happening now in Minnesota is that none of this would have happened if it wasn't for the George Floyd protests. And that Minnesota already had a moment in which it was forced to organize, in which it built the infrastructure and the communal infrastructure that allowed these last few months to happen. And you couldn't have seen that. You couldn't have known that. You don't know when these things will play out and how. But that is part of looking at what change looks like and what hopes looks like when we have a different framework that we think through. And I think that as far as kind of the more presentation side of things, I will leave it at that because I would much rather us have some time for a conversation and hear the thoughts and questions that you might have.
Okay. Tony,
So, do you know why you went to the UNC, went to the military? It's that you went, do you know what went to the military? In the military expo? Particularly at the expo?
say something about the military expo,
Um,
but repeat the question.
sorry, could you repeat the question again?
Yes.
Yeah.
So what do you learn about the expo? Why you went to the expo?
Right, about the military expo. So the military expo, the reason for me to go to it was for research, was to try to understand what's happening here. And I think it is, I mean, it is devastating to watch this very like clean environment in which people just walk around. There's literally a table with champagne at the entrance, and people took a nice glass of champagne at 10 a.m. To walk through all these stands with weapons, with drones, with all of these things, and to just listen to the conversations that are happening there that are exactly about, oh yeah, we use this system here and we use this system here. And that's how we kind of sell it in different places. One of the companies that had one of the kind of very central booths there, that was probably one of the busiest ones, is one called Smart Shooter, which is a company that makes sights for rifles, that prides itself on being able to make every soldier a sharpshooter. And that is a company whose stock went up 240% during the last 2.5 years. Has been bought by the military, by the US military as well. A lot of these sites. And then you think about that and you see how they talk about that. Look, we're making everyone a sharpshooter. And then all I can see in my head walking through that is, you know, the stories that you hear and the reports that you hear from doctors in Gaza about children coming in with headshots that could not be anything but a sharpshooter. And you wonder how many of them were actual sharpshooters and how many of them were soldiers that could become sharpshooters if you just get the right sight and let's sell it out. And like that, for me, I mean, it's a terrifying place to be, these military expos, but I think it's important for us so that we can understand how the system works. Thank you.
Who's next? Yeah, Kathy.
Was thinking you talked about change and how long it takes. I remember when we went to Palestine, we were in the occupied areas in May. And there's a part of you that just, you know, wants to change all of it. And we just want to shape people and really kind of believe, I think, you want to believe that there's something that you can do. When we asked the people that we went to, you know, to meet with, what is it that we can do? Most all of them said, you know, look for every opportunity that you have to stand up for what's just and what's right. Anybody who's being marginalized, you know, stand up for that. So I do think that is helpful when you feel like you can't really impact the big picture. And when we spoke with Fatwa Barghouti, am I saying it?
We met
The
with
wife of
we met with Father
Yes.
Brigadier Liston.
And I was just so shocked, I guess, when she said to us, you know, if it takes 100 more years, it will take 100 more years. If we can begin with just having our borders and being in charge of our own borders, you know, small thing, well, big, but steps like that, incremental steps. And when I thought of that, 100 years to, you know, even at the end of 100 years, it wouldn't be, I don't think, in her realistic mind, perfectly resolved, you know, but that really impacted me too. And it made me really very, very sad.
Can you summarize what she said?
Sure. So the second part of the comment, because I'll need a reminder for the first one in a second, just to summarize it, the second part of the comment was around Sahar Vardi, who's a Palestinian activist and also the wife of Marwan Barghouti, a very famous Palestinian politician who has been imprisoned for the last 27 years, I think. That she was talking about time in the sense of like maybe in 100 years we'll see change. And even in that, when we talk about change, to see it as something that is gradual, that maybe it's, I assume she was talking about a two-state solution as something that's not an end goal, but that we can also see it as a stepping stone to something else. And just having that kind of long-term, and you were saying that it was very sad for you to have the discourse there. And I understand that, and I understand the urgency, right? We feel urgency. We see things that are happening, and you can't just be like, well, in 100 years. And I think that the important thing to remember is that those two things are connected. Urgent action now and urgently speaking about what is happening now is what makes that change in 50 or 100 years. And it doesn't mean it doesn't make also change now. But that the large system, and I mean, 100 years is nothing. I know that it's funny, we're humans, we don't live that long, it's our entire lifetime. But in history, what is 100 years? That's nothing. And I think that a lot of cultures have that ingrained in them, that knowledge. And I feel like for me, that's one that's very much ingrained into me. But I feel like a lot of cultures don't. And this is a very young society. And so it's I think, much harder to think about things like 100 years is nothing. I live in a city that's 3,000 years old. What's 100 years?
Right. But to me, it felt like that's how long it would take for those hands to come off of the neck, just very gradually to give the Palestinians just that much more breath, to oxygen to breathe.
Could you speak to the psychology for Israeli citizenry to live in what Netanyahu is advocating, apparently a Spartan society? I remember working on some, talks a while back that PTSD amongst the IDF was less than the US because of this camaraderie of everybody needing that everybody serves. And yet, I didn't tell Mike this, I got this unsolicited Zionist thing in the mail not very long ago asking for donation to some organization because of the PTSD that was being experienced since among the IDF. So, and I know you have friends, I'm sure you have friends in or other refuseniks like yourself, but could you speak of that kind of psychological stuff from normal citizens and this PTSD idea that apparently is worsening?
Yeah, so I mean, the question of PTSD has risen many times within the Israeli context, especially after the 73 war. That was kind of the first time that as a society there was a real need to speak about it. And it is definitely being heard now quite a bit. There's been quite a few suicides of soldiers that were involved in the genocide. I think that one of the interesting things that is happening is the ability to talk about that, to talk about the trauma without talking about the reason for it. And that the reason for the trauma continues to be the fighting, the maybe comrades that were killed, and ignoring what the soldiers were doing. There was even writing about moral injury So this is apparently a psychological term that is being used quite a bit now. And it was interesting to see how Israeli psychologists were talking about moral injury and that soldiers are coming out of this military operation with moral injury. And they were talking about it in the context of soldiers who went in not agreeing with governmental policy in the sense of hostages should or should not be released, or like the military power is not the way to do that, and all kinds of ways around saying, well, how can you talk about moral injury of soldiers coming out of there without talking about genocide? Like, that is obviously the moral issue that people are dealing with. But I think that as a society, we so much do not see Palestinian lives as lives that we even don't see our own moral destruction as centered around Palestinian lives. And it's my brother was a career soldier for about 20 years up until a few months ago. And I could see the process that he went through. He wasn't a combat soldier, wasn't directly involved in Gaza, but he was part of that system. And he's a critical enough person or has enough voices around him that it was devastating for him. I mean, he was breaking down half the time, not knowing what to do. And he started, is this recording live or not live?
It's recording live.
It is recording live. Great. Won't speak too much about him, but it was interesting to see how he creates a mechanism that allows him to criticize Israeli policy, to have an emotional reaction to what's happening, and to not connect between his criticism and his emotional reaction, as if his actions are not the connecting factor between these two things. And I think that that's just an example of what I assume many people do. You build mechanisms to defend yourself, to protect your soul in those situations. And yes, Israeli society does that quite a lot. And as you say, the fact that it's a group experience, I don't know how much it makes it less traumatizing, although it possibly very much might, but it also makes it that what you're feeling sounds less like trauma because everyone's feeling it. If you have so many people around you feeling it, so many people around you acting in a way that is more aggressive, because we are all, over the last 2.5 years, acting more aggressive, as people do when they're in stressful situation. But when it's the entire society, it's much harder to see it than when it is the few veterans that come back into a community like it is in this country, and then you see the difference. We all go through that process. It's much harder to say this is trauma, this is PTSD. So I think that's possibly part of it, but I'm also not a mental health professional. And the conversation about this in Israel is really just starting to open up.
Could you speak on your own, just on your own decision, whatever that was, 10 years ago, whatever it was, and I met you in 2018, but to
refuse military service. I can. 17 years ago. That just makes me feel old. But I think in many ways I had a very uncommon experience with refusing military service, because I had the opportunity to actually be in Palestinian villages, to understand what the occupation was from a much younger age than most people do. Most people will not be in a Palestinian village, will not meet Palestinians in an actual conversation throughout the entire education system and most of adulthood. And I had a chance as a teenager to be in not just Palestinian villages, but in protests in Palestinian villages, in action together, in resisting together. And so in many ways, that because that happened far before military service for me, the decision of should I serve in the military or not was never a decision. It was never really a question for me. Feels rather ridiculous to be standing in a protest one day being shot by soldiers and then the next day being like, I should join them. And so in many ways, I had a much easier time in that decision than I think most people do, because for most people, it very much is breaking out of everything they've known until that point, and also breaking out from society and community in a way that, again, I was lucky enough that both my immediate family, but also because I was already an activist, my friend circle were activists, that I had a community in which that was fine to begin with. And for 18-year-olds that don't have that, which is the vast majority, that is a far harder choice to make.
Your grandmother, and then your jobs afterwards.
The on-demand stories. My grandmother, we'll see what happens with my grandmother. But let's see if there's other questions before I'll... Can we do that? Can we see if there's other questions before I get to those? I'll write them down, I promise.
Yes, please, Mariah.
I was curious, kind of tagging along to that. We have such division sown here, and our president thrives on that division. And sometimes, as you know, you have family kind of on the other side, and it's hard sometimes to know where to put your energy. Does it building a community with the people who already agree? I mean, you're here speaking with us, and we all agree that that needs to end, and we understand. Or is it trying to frame what's happening, in a certain way to convince people to join this, this fight for our civil rights, for Palestinian freedom? And so I guess, have you found a secret to where to put your energies, a way to frame your messaging, or like what advice would you have on kind of how to approach that?
It's a great question. I definitely do not have a key to that. I think for me, it is a lot about, I think changing hearts and minds is important for a lot of reasons. It's important for a lot of emotional reasons, especially of the ones that you love around you. But it is not the most effective political change mechanism. And that is a sad thing to say, because I care about the people I love. But I also know that the occupation is not going to end if I think I need to convince all of these people one by one that the occupation should end. It will end because of a change of power structures. It will end because different leverage. And that is also true here. ICE is not going to turn around and leave because we speak to enough people in the American public about this. That's not how it works. And that's not what happened in Minnesota. And we can give a million examples of this, right? Segregated schools did not end because enough people in the South were convinced that that is a good idea. Enough white people in the South were convinced that that is a good idea. That's just not how it happens. And in many ways, after structural change, we actually have much more opportunity to be changing people's minds. It's easier for people to be accepting of change when the structures have already been put in place to allow that. It's less threatening to them. And so for me, there's a question there about how does change happen? And that would be my answer. And there's a question to how do we move around our lives, which is not a political question. It's an emotional question. It's a personal question. And we all find what works for us, what sustains us. Obviously, we need a community that is supportive, that we all need that. But how much are you willing to engage in those other places? How much do you, a lot of my experience over the last few years is both asking myself, where do I draw a line in my relationships? What is the point in which I say, I love you, but I cannot have a relationship with you while you not just support this, while you are part of this? Right? I mentioned my brother before. These are real questions for me around my relationship with him. So where do you put that line? And also, I will say that I think that many times conversations with the people we love are always the hardest. That's always going to be the case. But many times, being who you are, with the information that you bring, with the lived experience of how your week looks like, and bringing that into the dinner table, not into the debate, not into the let's talk politics, but bringing that just as this is a legitimate and thing that exists, is also doing something. It also is moving people. But I really don't have good answers to not just where we should put energy, but where we draw those lines that are also, I think.
Yes, please.
Do you think that Israel's conduct and the way it kind of markets and presents itself, like globally, defense industry and beyond, is ironically anti-Semitic?
It's an interesting question. I mean, I think that any nation or any state doing things, like for me, it's like it should be anti-Israel. But yes, of course, there will be people that will take that to a place that what they see is Jewish money in different places, moving things around. And obviously that can feed into anti-Semitic ideas. I do want to say that that is a choice of people to tell that narrative. Like whoever takes it into anti-Semitic places are people who are choosing to do that. Because just as well, you could be talking about an American proxy or a state that came out of European colonial and nationalism that is doing that form of militarism or that is playing a specific role in a far wider militarist society in which this country spends more money on arms than the next 10 countries after it. Like it's all a question of the story that you choose to tell it. So does some of Israel's actions feed in to anti-Semitic tropes? Of course it does. But that's not like, but that's a choice to view it in that way. The relationship of the state of Israel with anti-Semitism is an extremely complicated relationship because one of the things that Israel has done very intentionally is try to make Judaism and the state one. And that is a very dangerous thing because it means that in the minds of so many people around the world, that was successful. Israel does look like the representation of the Jewish people, but then it is a state that commits genocide. It is a state that exports arms around the world. It is a state that does a lot of terrible things, like many nation states do. And when it claims to represent a people, it is very easy for that to become anti-Semitism. So in that sense, yes, it does definitely feed into it. And I think part of our responsibility is to divide those two again. Judaism is not Israel. Not all Jews support that. And I think we can say that that doesn't take off responsibility from Jewish communities who do support genocide, but it just says those two things are not the same concept. And we have to say that. We have to be very clear on that. And we have to be careful of the places where it's mixed up, where we start seeing Israeli connections to places because they are also Jewish and start seeing that little picture of an octopus in our head that was given to us by European anti-Semitism, and really beware of that and step back and say, well, that's not what I'm here to do. Our discourse and the reason or the core values of a movement for the liberation of Palestine, as well as so many of the other movements that people here are part of, are around being anti-racists. And that obviously includes being against anti-Semitism as well.
Terry, we have Terry and then Jeff, and then we're gonna wrap it up.
You haven't brought up the settler movement, the greater Israel idea. And I've been back and forth to Palestine for almost 30 years. And I haven't in the past heard terms like Judea and Samaria thrown around, the convergence of that with the American Christian nationalist movement and the Huckabees of the world, and moved the American embassy to Jerusalem, and now even having the State Department settlements. And so that connection to the Israeli settlement movement and the Greater Palestine right wing, if you can connect the dots.
Definitely. I mean,
Thanks, Terry.
the settler movement in Israel has, I mean, always had a very strong role in Israeli politics. But the ideological, what we call national religious settler movement, has increased its power within Israeli society significantly. And part of that was done through structures. If you look at today, a lot of the middle ranking officer level of the military, but also now a bit higher up than that, is from that ideological movement of the national religious settler movement. We see a similar thing starting to happen in the police. There's a lot of places within civil servant jobs that has happened. And that is a cultural question of a culture that very much promotes, I mean, it's from a place of not exactly volunteering, but from a place of commitment to the Zionist state, to that ideology, sending your children into those positions, deciding to be in those positions that will not make as much money and that will not, and from a value place, but a value that has quite a wider set of values that comes with it. And so we've seen that movement grow, and it translates into Israeli politics. I mean, the fact that we today have someone who, when I grew up, was seen, which is not that long ago, was seen as a crazy radical settler that was convicted of terror-related felonies, is now the minister of police, right? That is quite a shift, and he is not the only one there. So the settler movement has really gained a huge amount of political power in Israel. And in the last 2.5 years, there's a very famous quote of an Israeli settler politician who said, I mean, in the very early months after October 7th, said, we are living in a time of miracles. And this, for most of Israeli society, was like, what did you just say? But it represents a sentiment that is real for that settler movement, which was this moment in history allowed for the expansion of a settlement movement in ways that were not possible before. And not only in the West Bank, which is where we're obviously seeing the majority of it, and where just 2 weeks ago, Israel expanded its administrative authority into areas A and B, in a way kind of signifying we finished with Area C. That displacement and ethnic cleansing has already happened, and we're moving forward to the next level. But not only there, and not only with attempts and conversations about going back to Gaza, but also Lebanon, Syria, so that greater Israel is greater, substantially greater. And that is, I mean, that comes with a huge, I mean, it comes from a very deep also religious faith. It is something that I think for a lot of secular Israeli society still sees it as some crazy concept, and it's just those crazies, right? Nobody actually thinks there's going to be a greater Israel. But then they move into positions of power, and they, unlike us, do have hope, and very long, like that longevity of struggle is much easier in a religious context. And I know there's a lot of there are a lot of good things that can come out of religious contexts, but this is also a thing that is definitely part of it. And that faith is something that allows them, I think, to look at politics in a very different way than secular society looks at politics, and is terrifying.
Jeff, and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah, I was wondering if you had a chance to look at, I guess what would be described as American militarism. I guess you could say that it's, because I don't know, maybe you would call it militarism, but we have a very part of our culture, big part of our culture is our gun culture. That's centered around our Second Amendment rights, which would be described as the right to bear arms, and it's pushed by a very powerful group called the National Rifle Association, which has a lot of lobbying power in Washington, and it's a fact that it's well-known fact that there are more guns in the United States than there are Americans, and we're seeing some real serious problems like that, like our frequent problems with school shootings and things like that, which like most of the rest of the world doesn't have a problem with. So, I was wondering if you could maybe compare American militarism with Israeli militarism. And talk about that.
Yeah, I mean, they are very different in the sense that Israeli militarism is very much a collective militarism. And a lot of what happens here in the States is an individualized militarism, right? The right to bear arms builds on the idea exactly the opposite of collective militarism, right? It says we have the right to bear arms to protect ourselves from the collective militarism, right, from the state. And that is a very slightly unique and strange thing if we look at global nation states. And it has to do with a specific history of this place and how it came to be. But I think that the places where I do want to draw some similarities is that the right to bear arms, or in our context, who is armed in Israel, in military and security forces and stuff like that, is always of a specific group. And sure, theoretically, there's a right to bear arms. And yes, the Black Panthers woke up one day and said, hey, we do too. But for the most part, we know who bears arms in this country. And we know who really has that right. And that right is very much based on creating terror, creating fear from one group of population to another. It is about control. And it is interesting that here it is done outside of a state context as well, and not just within a state context. That is a very strange thing for militarism. But other than that, I do think that a lot of it is duplicated. Just as an example of that is important for me, I always speak about the fact that if you walk outside in anywhere in Israel, you will be shocked by the amount of weapons on the streets. And that those weapons do something to us as a society that is not spoken, but is very, very strong. It divides the society between those who see a weapon in public space and feel safe and feel that that weapon is there to protect them, and those who see a weapon in public space and feel threatened and know that that weapon is there to control them. And in most societies in the world, that usually is state weaponry that does that effect. And here we know that that is not only state weaponry, but that division is just the same. the white people in this room, no matter your politics, no matter how critical you are, you see an armed police officer on the street, your first reaction is not fear. You can be critical of it. You can even have lived experiences which you were, beaten up in protest or arrested. But you have been raised, I have been raised with the idea that serve and protect, right? That's what they're there for. And people of color in this country from a very young age know that that is not the reaction that they are supposed to have when they see an armed police officer. And that is the same for Palestinians back home, or also from marginalized Jewish groups, Ethiopian Jews and others. That weapon in public space is there to control them. And that is very true in this country, including for civilian arms. And that is something that, I definitely cannot offer any solutions for that. But I think that is an interesting thing of your militarism that you need to figure out. What do you do with that is different than other forms of militarism?
Let's say thank you to Sahar for being here tonight.